Hi, Misha here, and we do talk about Mausers a decent bit on the channel, but often it's model 1898s or the like. Last year I did do kind of a Mauser overview video focusing on Paul Mauser, but I thought today would be fun to kind of talk about a couple of the early versions chambered for 7mm. So I have four laid out. On the top is the long rifle. This is a Chilean 1895. And then we have my Spanish 1895 Carabina or carbine. And actually, even though these are both called 1895, they're different systems. The carbine is, of course, based on the Mauser 1893. Moving down, we have two short rifles, one Chilean, one Spanish. Both have kind of intermediate 21 some odd inch barrels. So kind of represent the in-between. So we have two Chilean, two Spanish. We have two 93 pattern, two 95 pattern, and we have all chambered for 7mm, 7x57. And so, yeah, I thought let's just kind of talk about the history here and talk about what makes the two patterns a little bit different. Now, I don't actually own a Spanish 1893 infantry rifle, but this Chilean 1895 will do just nicely. Both had a 29-inch barrel. Both weigh between 8.6 and 8.8 pounds. And both fired 7mm from an internal double-stack magazine. Although we will talk about the few differences later. So, going back to the 1880s, Spain had been using Remington rolling block rifles, similar to this one, although this one's chambered for 7mm Mauser, so it's a later style. But it gives you the idea. These were single shot, hammer fired guns with a rolling bleach block here. So very much single shot, although for their day and time, they were cartridge fired, which was pretty good tech for the 1860s. And at first, Spain was looking at the Turkish or Ottoman model 1887 Mauser, which was a very late black powder, verging on very early smokeless powder rifle. But they had several complaints. This would lead to them acquiring a small number, around 1,200, model 1889, really 1890, even 1891 type guns for testing. And this would be based on initially the Belgian model, and then later would be adopted by Argentina. And these would be firing Mauser's first smokeless powder round, 7.65 by 53. Yes, Hobo. Yes, Hobo. She insisted on coming out here. Yes, you did. Anyway, distractions aside, after trying out the 1889/91, the Spanish had some suggestions. They really weren't crazy about the extractor. They felt it to be weak. They also thought the detachable single stack 5-round mag could easily be lost. And they'd had some problems with double feeds and whatnot for the bolt system. They gave Paul Mauser these notes, as did other users, and so he would present to them in 1892 first his next model, known as the Model 1892, which, while it still had a single stack magazine down here, it was fixed as part of the trigger guard, but it involved this new bolt system with this big claw rotating extractor. Big improvement there. It also was made safer, had a new bolt system, caulking system, with a new safety, the kind of now famous 3 position. But it was still chambered for 7.65, at least for a bit. Later, in 1892, Mauser would present the Spanish with his latest invention, 7mm Mauser, or 7x57, which was a much improved cartridge over 7.65 Mauser. It had more room for powder, it was a slightly thinner, higher velocity bullet, just a better shooting cartridge. And the Spanish really liked what they saw with the 1892 and the new round. Thus, in July of 1893, after some field trials and testing, they ordered initially 20,000, up a month later in August to 30,000 rifles. And so they were prepared to buy the 1892. But really, before it could go into full production, they would change it up for the 1893. In December, the order would be changed. Now, the Loewe factory in Germany would build about 5,000 to 8,000 1892s for testing for Spain, so they did have some. But as far as the full contract, not really. Instead, in December, it was changed to the 93. And the big advancement with the 93 was this newfangled box magazine, which was double stack, double column, and flush fit with the receiver. This would give several advantages over the single stack that used to hang down. And thus, Loewe in Germany would start to crank these out for Spain in 1893, leading into 94. And initially, Spanish orders would tally up to about 200,000. By the end of German production for Spain around 1899, it would actually be a little bit higher, nearly 207,000. And from that point, licensed production would be started in Spain, beginning in 1896, although it really wasn't at full capacity and full production until 1898 at the Armas factory, Oviedo. And the production of the original 1893 infantry rifle would continue really up through 1943, at least in some capacity. And that let them retire out their older single shots, although, like this one here, some of them ended up in 7mm regardless. But that was the long rifle. They were definitely intending to buy a carbine, but it would take a little bit of time. Finally adopted in May of 1895 for cavalry and artillery. This is the Carabina, model 1895. And it is a 93 system, just with a shorter barrel. It's about 17.6 inches. Flush, fully stocked nose. No bayonet, because again, cavalry. The rifle had a rear sight from 400 to 2,000 meters. Pretty standard. The carbine got itself a littler sight, which was, if I can lift it up here, very stiff on this one, which was graduated up to about 1,400 meters. Still very optimistic. And, whereas the rifle had a straight bolt handle, the carbine had a turn-down handle. Otherwise, it had the same flush magazine. Now, originally, the pattern adopted in 1895 just had a saddle ring here. But, really before full production was underway, in 1896 or 97 or so, they would add side sling bars. Now, this one's missing the rear one because it has the swivel here still. but they would add those as slingable options. And that was the first, major update for the gun. The initial ones would be produced by Loewe. They'd build about 22,500 for Spain, and then production would be transferred to the Armas factory in Spain. It's also worth pointing out that Loewe would kind of be rolled into DWM in production for all Mausers in Germany after 1896 would be under the DWM name, which is an easy way for collectors to quickly determine if a gun is considered antique or not. If it's Loewe, then it is antique. So production would continue in Spain. The long rifles, they would build about 500,000 more, in addition to the over 200,000 they had. And for the carbines, they would build over 850,000 more, meaning that, we have a pretty good number of each. And production of the carbine would last until around 1916, when it was finally kind of replaced in service. So, what about the military service? Because there definitely was some famous events in the 19th century. Right as the carbine was being adopted in 1895, Spain would use its new infantry rifles to put down a rebellion in Cuba. It would also station many in the Philippines. And this would set the stage for 1898, the Spanish-American War. And this is really where the Spanish 7mm Mauser became very famous in the West. And no more so than July of 1898 at San Juan Hill. Most people kind of remember the Spanish-American War as a crushing victory for the USA, and overall it certainly was, especially the Navy. But at San Juan Hill, the Mauser really showed that it was just vastly superior to the Craig Jorgensen that America was fielding. At the time, these would have been the original 1892s or the relatively recently released 1896s, and they would be both rifles and carbines. The Spanish would have around 750, some sources say 800 defenders equipped with their Mausers. As far as I know, these were the long rifles, at least the vast majority. The U.S. would have about 6,600 immediate attackers being supported by artillery and Gatling guns. Some sources inflate that number quite a bit, but, to be realistic about exactly who was engaged there. And some would have the Craig, some would have older trapdoors, to be fair, so single shots. It did not go well. The Spanish held the Americans off for quite some time. And even when it was over, the Americans had taken about 1,400 killed plus injured, whereas the Spanish had 58 killed plus some injured. Yeah, so America won simply because of overwhelming numbers. And then the answer is simple. The Mauser system here, this version, the 1893, was just clearly superior. The 7mm cartridge was flatter shooting, had longer range, had higher velocity, up to 300 to 400 feet per second higher velocity. It simply was more accurate. And, just as important, it was easy to top off. Of course, Mausers have always been famous for their charger or stripper clip systems. And this was already the second or even third generation of it, quite well refined. So it was very quick and easy to reload these guns. Whereas the Craig, you had to pop open the side and essentially dump cartridges in, meaning the Spanish, as long as they had ammunition, had a much higher rate of fire. So better accuracy, higher rate of fire, and the guns were very reliable and had good sights for the day and time. And of course, this would eventually lead to the U.S. adopting the 1903 because they had captured quite a few Spanish guns during the war, and many were sent to the Springfield Arsenal, and they used those to kind of build their own gun, which led to the whole royalty payments issue, but that's a story for another day. Moving on from there, when America tried to occupy the Philippines, they again encountered the Spanish 7mm Mauser, and it was again used to some great effect. In fact, just a handful of Spanish soldiers were able to hold out nearly a whole year in one location in the Philippines until after a treaty was officially signed. So they did quite well. And this is really what made the Mauser famous. And keep in mind, this was really right as Germany is adopting the 1898 system. But it wouldn't end there. The Chilean guns, or at least the 1895 guns, would also add to the Mauser's reputation, esteem. The situation in Chile was a little different. For one, it had recently adopted this model here, the Austrian Steyr Mannlicher 1888, later 1888-90, old and rusty today. Back 100 and some odd years ago, this was cutting edge tech, straight pull bolt action, on block fed, and it was again kind of one of those verging. It was considered semi-smokeless powder initially. Later, the 8x50 cartridge was updated to smokeless. So Chile had this. At least it was going into service. It also had a civil war in 1891. Essentially, it was kind of the Army versus Navy game, only for real with live bullets. The situation would be resolved as such. And then in 1892, kind of after the war, seeing how their guns were working and witnessing their neighbors updating their guns, Chile started having trials. And early on, the Spanish, I guess you'd call it interim or transitional model 1892, was of great interest to them. And they liked both the 7.65 and 7mm rounds. So that was kind of an early favorite, but another round of trials, kind of done by a different faction in Chile the following year, decided it would rather go with the Didito 6.5mm. I'm not sure why. I've had those guns before. They're interesting, but anyway. So there's different camps forming. And in 1894, towards the end of the year, the president of Chile kind of called a conference with all the military leaders and whatnots and said, okay, it's time to pick a new rifle. At this time, tensions were rising with Argentina, and other South American nations were kind of buying new guns, a lot of them going Mauser. So this old Steyr is looking old, even after only half a decade. Interestingly enough, there was also kind of a battleship arms race going on in South America at this time too, so it wasn't just small arms. For one reason or another, they decided to now swing back towards the Mauser. And being rather shrewd businessmen, in 1895, they kind of played the various manufacturers. We had Steyr in Austria that was making Mausers. You had FN Herstal in Belgium making Mausers. And of course, you have Loewe, soon to be DWM, in Germany making Mausers. And so they kind of played it off to see how they could get the most bang for their buck, the most advanced model, and at the lowest price. And in the end, they went with Germany for a few reasons, including logistics and support. Steyr was the highest bid, and FN was the lowest, but there was some technical issues, and anyway, Germany had the latest model, the 1895 here. So, beginning to appear in 1896, we had the Chilean model of 1895 Mauser. And they ordered 80,000 29-inch infantry rifles. And some 30-odd thousand carbines. And there's actually two different carbines, and we usually refer to them as a carbine and a short rifle. This is a short rifle. The carbine is extremely similar to the Spanish version. It's just a hair over 37 inches long. It has a 17.6-inch barrel. Some places claim 18.3, but based on math, that doesn't seem to be correct. It also had this longer carbine or short rifle, which was identical, except it had a 21.3-inch barrel, and thus an overall length of a hair over 41 inches. It still had the 1,400-meter rear sight and side sling mounts. And originally, of course, these would be delivered from Loewe and then DWM, who would continue making the 1895 pattern until 1900. And with that, let's finally talk about what really sets the two patterns apart. So here's our Spanish carbine compared with our Chilean short rifle. You'll notice the stocks end about the same exact place, but the Chileans extended out a bit more. This allows for the standard bayonet lug and a cleaning rod, which the carbine does not. Otherwise, yeah, they're extremely similar, just right down to their bent bolts. The Chilean doesn't have the saddle ring, but it's neither here nor there. So the differences, they're quite slight, and they have to do with the bolts. So with the Chilean here, the 1895, notice that you can manipulate the bolt back and forth. With the 93 pattern, though, once you pull it back, you can't push it forward. That's because one of the updates that Mauser did to the 93 was to put a bolt hold open follower in the magazine. Something not present on the 95. The bottom is kind of rounded off so that the bolt pushes it down. Sorry guys, I know it's moving. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. Now both are still cock-on close, so-called small ring. But there is a difference in the bolt. I'm going to sit you down for a second. 93. Put you up there for a second. And come on, Hefe. 95. So the 93 was the first pattern to use the new internal magazine. And to help with feeding, the bottom of the bolt is squared off. But they soon discovered that machining really wasn't worth it and not necessary. So at the 95, they went to a standard kind of round bolt. Just a little bit of a machining shortcut. Another thing, the 93 was a standard 2-lug locking bolt. And as many of you know, the 98 pattern actually has an emergency lug in addition to the 2. Now there's not really a modification to the bolt itself for this, but as kind of an emergency lug, this lip was added on the back of the receiver. Right there. So when the bolt locks down, it hits the back of the handle here. Thus, if there is a blowout, a little extra reinforcement. Something else that's kind of fun, the bolt from a 95 will typically fit within tolerances, a 93 gun. Let's see if this one will. Yes. But a bolt from a 93, because of the square bottom, will not fit a 95. There's no clearance there. So there's a small bit of machining difference in the back. This is squared off back here for the bolt, whereas this is rounded because it does not need that extra cutout. And honestly, yeah, that's the difference. The 95 is considered the first update after the 93, but is still very much in the same family. That's why I don't really mind having the long rifle representing my 93, because the differences are almost entirely internal. With just this little lip here for a reinforcing lug, which mechanically, you know, pretty important. See? Bolt, how it locks down. And again, it is a cock on close action with a three-way, pretty standard Mauser safety. So Chile would continue to employ all three versions, rifle, short rifle, and carbine. Throughout the 19th century, production would officially end at Mauser DWM around 1900, and they would continue in Chilean service well into the 20th century. And in fact, there was an effort around 1910 to refurbish and upgrade their guns, which ultimately would kind of turn in to a whole new series known as the M1912, manufactured by Steyr, who was a subcontractor for DWM, and these were 98 patterns. But nevertheless, the original 95s would continue in Chile. They would also be used by several other South American nations like Costa Rica, Peru, I think Guatemala had some, and they were also famously used in Mexico, including during the revolution in the early 20th century there. But another famous user would be the Orange Free State, the Boers, and South Africa. In fact, this is almost as famous as the Chilean guns. They would start to receive them beginning in 1896. DWM would start shipping them down, and they originally were going to send out about 50,000 of the 95s. They also were sending down some older 93 patterns, not just to the well, you know the situation there. You had a lot of armed militia, even farmers. They even were sold commercially, sometimes known as the Boer Model 3. Regardless, the 7mm and the 93, 95 actions made their way to South Africa until the British set up a naval blockade. This meant that some of the later shipments couldn't be delivered and instead were diverted to Chile to kind of fill that contract. And the guns originally destined for Africa would be marked OVS, which basically stood for Orange Free State. And so you can find some Chilean guns with African markings, which is kind of unique. And the ones that did make it there, and they had carbines as well as rifles, kind of ended up teaching the British a similar lesson to what America had learned a year earlier in Cuba. In 1899, the Second Boer War, the British had their newfangled Lee Metfords and very new Lee Enfields with their .303 round, but these were not charger loaded, and .303 was originally kind of a black powder cartridge. So between being stripper clip loaded and 7mm being a kind of second generation smokeless round, yet again the Boers with these Mausers outranged, out-accurized, out-everythinged the British. kind of owning them. This would actually lead in Britain to the pattern 1913 and then the pattern 1914, which actually come full circle back to America with the model 1917. So it's interesting that the 1893 inspired the 1903, and the 1895 inspired the British infield Mauser patterns, which ultimately kind of came back to America too. But it was just showing everyone how far ahead of the game these guns were in the 1890s, and that's because Paul Mauser listened to his customers and did continual and constant upgrades, not just for accuracy and all that, but also the 7mm round had very good penetration for that day, and the action was very safe for that day and time. But it could be improved upon, which would ultimately come with the model 1898, the Gewehr 98 action, which is, yeah, the permanent Mauser. But it wasn't so much better that users of these were just willing to get rid of them. They were still very good guns. And with that, we move kind of into the 20th century. One new concept of the 20th century was a universal short rifle. Instead of having a long rifle for infantry and a truly small carbine for cavalry, why not have just one? The U.S. was an early adopter of this concept, again with the 1903, and Britain would soon go to it with the infield SMLE. And Spain would kind of go to it as well. Now, again, short rifles have been made for various Mauser patterns for some time. In fact, Spain did try out a short rifle with about a 21 and some change inch barrel around 1894 before ultimately going to a true carbine, but I guess the idea never really left them. In 1913, Spain would go to a new Spitzer cartridge. Originally 7mm, like all rounds of the day, was a round-nosed bullet. But in 1913, they went to a Spitzer. Germany had done the same with its 8mm round about a decade earlier. And for the new round, we have higher velocity, more flash, more concussion. The rifles could easily be retrofitted with their 29-inch barrels to fire it, just changing up the sights a bit. But the carbines, they thought about changing them. In 1913, they came out with a new pattern. It was tested the following year as the model 1913, and it was essentially the same as we have here, even with the short barrel, but it had a bayonet mount. But they quickly discovered, much as Germany had done earlier with the original Car 98, that a 18-inch barrel with a modern Spitzer round, it's not ideal. Therefore, work at the Oviedo Armas arsenal would come out, and this would be adopted in November of 1916 as the model 1916 short rifle, or Mishaco. And this is just as it sounds, much like our short rifle up here. It has a 21-inch barrel. Now it's ever so slightly longer at about 21 3/4, whereas this was 21.3, so just under a ½ inch longer. Still firing 7mm. It takes the bayonet. It has front sight protectors, and in most other ways is still a 93 action. Again, kind of adopted as a extended carbine to fire the new cartridge, and this is what would replace this one more or less in service, although they would keep the long rifle in production at Oviedo through at least 1943. Flipping these over, you can see the side sling mount that's on all. Of course, we have the very distinctive front side protectors, short cleaning rod. This takes a new pattern called the 1913 bayonet. As far as I know, they're still interchangeable, but they did go to a newer pattern. Here is the side sling bar. Again, this one could have one here, and this has the old school German placement. It's a much simpler bar, moved further back. Another interesting feature of this one that some had is a hinged floor plate. There's a release in the trigger guard, hinges up, kind of Arasaka style, frankly, versus the original pattern where you use a bullet, but it's fully detachable. You know, a way to make it both easier to use and also easier to not lose. Interestingly, some of these have kind of a lange style or roller coaster style rear sight. Not all, but some. That's one thing I thought was neat about this gun when I picked it up. There were several minor variations in the 1916 Mishaco. And you'll notice something else. Because of the newer, even higher pressure, higher velocity round, they added a gas relief hole in the receiver here. Just a little bit of extra safety. Now this is still a 1893 bolt with this squared off bottom. They didn't go away from that, but they also added a gas relief hole on its base in case of, again, ruptured cases, which can happen when you have less than perfect quality control of your ammunition. But otherwise, it's basically the same gun, just an intermediate size. Again, just under 42 inches long, and was produced not only at Oviedo, but also between 1936 and 1939. It was produced at the Carabina arsenal. And these were not used in World War I because Spain really stayed out of that war. But of course, they were used during the Spanish Civil War, which lasted until, well, 1939. So that was the time they saw the most use on both fascist and communist republic sides. And Oviedo produced over 300,000. And I don't know how many Catalunya produced, but all told in Spain, about 2 million Mauser 93 based guns were built. So, not an insignificant number. In Chile, the 95 was replaced by the later 1912 and then later guns from that point on. But in Spain, because they produced them in country, it would see use for decades. After the end of the Civil War, Franco, very closely allied, at least unofficially, with Nazi Germany, decided to switch from 7mm to 8mm Mauser. Thus, a new model was adopted as the M43 in 1943. This was a K98K variant, but kind of outside the scope of this video. This is why the 95 carbine was pretty much out of commission by this point. The 93 rifle was out of production, but the 1916 would continue on. They would continue to build these at Oviedo throughout the 1940s, with the last ones officially assembled, probably from existing parts, in 1951. And what's interesting, beginning in the 1940s, many were either rebarreled or just built to fire 8mm 7.92. This receives a lot of criticism because this is a small ring Mauser. And furthermore, in the 1950s, as Spain would adopt the Setme rifle, Model A, B, and eventually the C in the 1960s, they would rebarrel some 1916s to fire 7.62 Setme, but often called 7.62 NATO or 308. Now some look just like this, while others get the full FR7 treatment. But again, that's kind of outside the scope of this video. But there has been a lot of criticism of both the rebarreled 1916s and the FR7s. Nevertheless, they stayed as training aids and Garda Civil rifles through the 1950s and well into the 1960s, some of them not being surplused out until decades later. So, quite the long lineage. The quality of the Spanish manufacturing varies, but overall, it's acceptable. And of course, the quality of the original German-built guns is outstanding. In fact, the South American contract guns are still kind of hidden gems because of the high quality of bluing and serial matching parts and wood. These guns before World War I were made to an exceedingly high standard in Germany. That's not to say the FN guns and the Steyr guns weren't, but the German guns, the Loewe and the DWM, just outstanding workmanship and craftsmanship on these guns. Very smooth bolts, very nice triggers, a very different era and time. That's why I wanted to kind of talk to you about these 7mm. Originally I thought about splitting this into 2 videos, but I just couldn't really do them separately because, again, I don't have the full Spanish set or the full Chilean set, but together they kind of cover them. And a couple of these are pretty new to my collection, whereas a couple of them have been around for a very long time. So with that, I appreciate you hanging out with me. This was an abridged version, believe it or not. There's a lot of information on these guns, especially with like the Orange Free State and the Boers and all that, and a lot of the Civil War use of the 1916s. So I did my best to balance the two. If you could, as always, please like, share, and subscribe. And please feel free to comment. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.